Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Muriel, good morning, I should say. I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C. I am joined today by members of my cabinet. We are also joined by the chairman of the Council of the District of Columbia, Council Chairman Phil Mendelson. And as we have done throughout our response to the pandemic, the chairman and I have shared this Monday before the council's meeting for the chairman's regular update on the council's agenda. Following the chairman's update, we will provide our situational update. And then we will hear from members of my team, including Deputy Mayor Falchicchio, Housing and Community Development Director Polly Donaldson, Executive Director of the DC Housing Finance Agency Chris Donald, and Dr. Nesbitt and Chris Rodriguez will be available for questions. So with that, I turn to Chairman Mendelson.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. Good morning to everyone. So tomorrow, December 1st, the council will be meeting its regular legislative meeting for the month of December, and also an additional committee of the whole meeting that will start at noon. And tomorrow's meeting is important because it's the second to the last meeting of council period 23, which is to say that any bills that have not been voted on at least once by tomorrow will die with this council period and have to be reintroduced. So there are 6 bills that are on the committee of the whole agenda for markup in the committee of the whole, and another 22 bills that have been reported out of other committees. So that'll be the committee of the whole. The bills that are being marked up by the committee of the whole, so this would be the first vote by a committee vote, are there's 6. I'm not going to go through all of them, but of the more important ones, the Department of Buildings Establishment Act, which proposes to break up DCRA into 2 agencies, one that focuses on construction and residential housing, and then the remaining would be a new or separate department. There's that legislation. I'm happy to take questions on that. The second bill is Cashless Retailers Prohibition Act, which is a bill that was introduced before the pandemic to require that businesses have to accept cash, that they can't be non-cash businesses. There are some exceptions in the bill, for instance, for parking lots, and also exceptions during a public health emergency such as the current pandemic, where maybe the use of cash isn't the most desirable from a public health perspective. But the challenge is that in the district, roughly 30% of our residents are unbanked or underbanked, which means that they don't have access to credit, or that they have to pay much higher fees for credit. And so for a business to be cashless means that that business is unavailable to those individuals. As I said, there's 6 bills. I'm not going to name all of them, but the other one I will mention for markup in the committee of the whole is the Displaced Workers' Right to Reinstatement and Retention Amendment Act. This legislation follows example adopted in at least a couple other jurisdictions. At the time the bill was introduced, the state of California had adopted legislation like this, and New York City had. New York's was limited to hotels. California's was broader. And this bill would require that for businesses over, I believe it's 35 employees as of March 1st, so we're looking back in time, that as they reopen, and we hope that they reopen, as they reopen, and they're looking to hire, that they would have to reach out first to former employees, those employees who had worked there prior to the pandemic. This does not include former employees who were fired or forced to resign. And the bill requires nothing more than that. It's just basically giving those who've lost their jobs because of the pandemic a shot at being rehired as that business reopens for business. Of the bills that are being reported out of other committees, the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development is reporting out 3 bills establishing a commission on poverty, a ban on non-compete agreements in the District of Columbia. I know that that bill has some controversy around it, and a bill that would make permanent law that we've already adopted with regard to extending unemployment benefits. There's a bill that's reported out of the Committee on Human Services that would establish an Office of Ombudsman for related to the Child and Family Services Agency, CFSA. to help the council with oversight with regard to that very important function of the government, which is child welfare. Two bills that were reported out of the Committee on Housing and Neighborhood Revitalization. One is rental housing source of income, which makes clear in the law that landlords cannot discriminate when they are advertising or offering apartments for rent based on the source of income. This is meant to help those who have vouchers that they can compete fairly for a rental unit. The other bill is the voluntary agreement moratorium, which would put a moratorium on voluntary agreements that landlords sometimes strike with their tenants. This is with tenant associations, really, not just an individual tenant. And this would be a 2-year moratorium on that. There's a bill that was reported out of the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety that would make some changes, hopefully improvements to the initiative and referendum process to make sure that when legislation in that way is put on the ballot, that among other things, it's been reviewed in terms of how it's written for completeness and correctness, if you will, reviewed by our general counsel and by the attorney general. And another bill that was reported out of the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, which has a new and longer title, Bella Evangelista and Tony Hunter Panic Defense Prohibition and Hate Crimes Response Amendment Act, essentially bans the gay panic defense that has sometimes been used by defendants who've been accused and are being prosecuted for assault or even for homicide, where they say, well, actually they acted out of an impulse because they didn't realize that the person was gay and therefore they panicked. And if there's a little sarcasm in my voice, it's because I think that it's not a genuine defense, and this bill would prohibit that defense in court. As I said, there are 22 bills that came out of other committees and 6 for markup by the committee of the whole. It's a total of 28. Those are just the highlights. My staff circulated to you all a copy of the agenda yesterday, so maybe you have questions about something else. With the legislative meeting, I'll just mention a few of the bills there. For final vote are 2 interjurisdictional compacts. One, an interjurisdictional compact to permit telepsychology to broaden or create more flexibility with regard to access by district residents to psychologists, and the interstate physical therapy compact approval, which is, I think, close to 30 states have now joined this compact, and it's only been in existence for a couple of years. Again, to broaden access to physical therapy. There's a bill for final reading that would require for substantial renovation and new construction of office buildings that there has to be, I think it's 20% of the parking spaces have to be equipped for electric vehicle charging. There are 2 bills that deal with commemorations like statues and going forward, as well as looking at current names. We're setting up a commemoration task force to look at names, and a Diverse Washingtonians Commemoration Amendment Act, which will try to get more statuary or other memorials to diverse Washingtonians. Diverse could be women, it could be African Americans, other minorities. The goal is to really do more to look at and promote our history. There's another bill for final reading that would be the first step in a compact amendment to the WMATA Compact. So Maryland and Virginia would have to follow suit to set up an independent police complaints review board for WMATA. It would not be completely independent, it would be part of WMATA, but it would be independent of the transit police. And that's scheduled for final vote tomorrow. The Council will be considering a resolution regarding the submission requirements for next year's budget. It's a little hard to believe that we're already there, but this would set forth the submission requirements, among other things, that the budget would be transmitted to the Council March 31st. Hopefully we will not be seeing a repeat of what happened this year where we delayed the budget, which we had to do. It'd be nice to get back to a more normal schedule. There's also an emergency bill that I'm putting forward that would revise the emergency legislation we've adopted around the pandemic that told any FOIA requests. And this is going to reopen somewhat gradually the process for FOIA requests, FOIA's Freedom of Information Act. I believe it is beginning January 15th in the legislation. Some agencies have been able to process FOIA requests. I believe the electronic requests, like looking at email, are easier to do than when it requires in-person reviewing documents. And this is meant at trying to ease that the stoppage that basically occurred, the tolling that occurred. Councilmember Bonds is moving an extension of a program through our Housing Finance Authority with regard to helping seniors with reverse mortgages where they've been caught up in a reverse mortgage and are about to be foreclosed. This program provides some assistance. Not all of the money has been spent, so this would extend that program. And Councilmember Allen and I are moving an amendment to the emergency adopted in the summer regarding police and policing to extend the deadline for the Police Reform Commission. I believe we're extending it to April 30th. I think we're expecting that they will complete their recommendations by April 1st and that they will then want just an additional month to deal with testimony and so forth. That's not everything, but that's what I think are the highlights of what we're considering tomorrow. I'm happy to take some questions, and I'll be sticking around so there'll be questions after the mayor as well. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last few days, you accused the D.C. Chamber of Commerce of lying, your word, about a proposed False Claims Act amendment. That's unusually harsh public language by you. Why that tone, and what's been the reaction from the Chamber? Have you spoken to the Chamber since, and what is the status of the bill?
Well, I had reached out to the Chamber last week about, they had put out a so-called call to action, and it was full of falsities and mistruths, and I demanded that they retract it. I heard nothing, so I put out that statement yesterday. The bill that's before us for final reading is a bill that takes existing law, False Claims Act. It's been in existence for a couple of decades. It's been used successfully. Basically what it does is it takes advantage of whistleblowers who have inside information. The government's unaware of it. They know that the government's being cheated, and they can, in the name of the district government, file a suit. If they're successful, the district gets the bulk of the money that we were cheated out of, but the whistleblower gets a small amount. Could be between, I think it's 15 and 30%. Almost every state in the federal government has a False Claims Act. When it was originally adopted by the district, we excluded taxation because the federal government excluded it. This bill would include tax matters. The mistruths are to suggest that any tax issue, even where one has gotten an audit and gotten a clean bill of health, or where they went to the CFO and got advice, that all that could be second-guessed in one of these lawsuits. That's just false. That's inaccurate. It has to be fraud. So if a taxpayer goes to the CFO for advice and gets advice and follows that advice, that's not fraud. So that's why I use that harsh language. This is really the government taking advantage, and it's not unique to the district. Laws like this exist in most of the states, taking advantage of those in the private sector, I'll call them whistleblowers, who have inside information of where the government is being cheated.
All right. Thank you very much for that explanation, but it's just so rare, I don't think I can recall you use the word lies. That seems more personal than just a disagreement.
Well, I think that when a lobbyist puts forth false information, call it for what it is, false.
Lie.
Yeah. I use some other words in that press release as well, Tom.
I'm not using the word lie today, though.
I'll be happy to use the word. They lied.
Okay, thank you.
Mark.
Chairman, on the Cashless Retail Prohibition Act, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, can you say, is this first read or final read on that?
Cashless retail is first reading.
First reading. And Mayor Bowser, could I ask you if this, I know it's just first reading for this cashless bill, but is this something that you support?
It gives me pause knowing what I know about what our businesses and workers are dealing with. The chairman outlined, however, what the government's concern is, and that's that a great number of our people could be excluded from going to certain businesses. So it's a balance. I will read closely the exceptions that the chairman referred to make sure that I could support the bill.
Thank you.
And I'll note, Mark, it's not unusual that as a bill moves forward, that we get feedback from the executive, and where there are concerns, that we try to work them out.
Could I follow up on a second?
Sure.
The gay panic defense. And I'm remembering the Tony Hunter case, which I think is one of the things that may have spawned this bill.
Yes.
But if you recall, the Tony Hunter case was actually pled down.
To a misdemeanor.
To a misdemeanor, in part because of the gay panic defense. If this legislation is successful, would it prohibit the prosecutors from pleading down a case? I guess it would prohibit that defense, but it would also close that loophole that allowed the prosecutors to accept a lesser plea. Because I believe you went, I think it was Channing Phillips actually back then, who you asked to actually take it to trial, and they didn't.
Yeah, I was pretty upset about that case. That was an incident near the, what used to be the B-Bar on 9th Street, near the convention center, and there was an individual, I believe with his partner, walking in that area. I guess they'd left the B-Bar and they were assaulted. It was hard to get the U.S. attorney to prosecute the case, and ultimately they did plea it down. I mean, the guy died. He was hit in this robbery, and he was knocked to the ground, and he hit his head, and he died. And ultimately it was pled, if I remember correctly, as a misdemeanor assault. It was pretty outrageous. I think it speaks to a problem with our prosecutorial system, that we don't have local control over our prosecutorial system. But this bill, yes, it would speak to that in terms of the defense. The defense could not be made. Oh, I didn't know the person was gay and I panicked. The defense couldn't be made, but it doesn't speak to the plea bargaining process. That's something we've been frustrated with for years, but I don't think there's an easy answer to how we would legislate restrictions on plea bargaining.
Thank you.
Sam?
I was going to ask what Tom asked, so you already answered the question.
Okay.
Chairman, I just wanted some clarification on the right to worker reinstatement bill. It seems to be written somewhat broadly to include any worker who lost a job during the pandemic, not necessarily those who lost their job expressly because of the pandemic. Could you specify what workers this bill applies to, and are you planning any amendments?
It would apply, it is more broadly than just workers who lost their job because of the pandemic, because then that requires an analysis of why did that individual lose his or her job. But we try to get at its correlation with the pandemic by the date. So it has to be an employee who was employed before March 1st. It's roughly when the pandemic hit. Hotels are a little different because of their seasonal nature. So it does apply to any employee, but it's by that date. And, oh gosh, what was I thinking? The bill also speaks to hotels, restaurants, entertainment, and events. It's those four sectors, so it's not any employee. And then it also speaks to businesses with 35 or more employees. So we're not talking about mom and pop.
And are you planning any amendments?
Well, it's coming up for markup tomorrow, so no, I'm not planning on any, but we will, there may need to be some refinement. The bill is, I think, about 10 pages long for a simple concept, so there could be some refinement between now and second reading.
Thank you.
The idea is to be very minimally burdensome. So there's just a simple notification, if I remember correctly, not less than 10 days, period. As long as you, the employer, have a record that you notified the former employee, give them a time of not less than 10 days to respond, set a deadline, then you can go ahead and hire somebody else. But first chance is with the former employee. Mr. Rice.
Back to the whistleblower bill. As I remember, it did pass first reading,
Yes.
and the main opposition, as I remember, was from Councilmember Pinto. who said, well, you know, let's postpone the vote because I don't like it, but I'd like to talk to you to make some adjustments. Have you had that conversation with her?
I've had several conversations with her.
And has it been smoothed out? Do you think it'll pass unanimously now, or?
The bill passed comfortably on first reading, but I'm not going to predict that it will be unanimous tomorrow. But I'm confident that it will pass.
If you care to, why is there opposition to something that seems obvious? A lot of other people are doing it. It's more money for the district. It rewards people for coming forward.
Well, this kind of gets back to my back and forth with Mr. Sherwood. I think there's been some fear-mongering around this. And so there's this idea that anybody can sue. And so now everybody's going to be having to hire attorneys to defend themselves. That just simply has not been the case with this act in the district in areas where it is currently legal or authorized, and that's not been the case in other jurisdictions. There is in the committee report a letter from the Attorney General of New York State where this bill is modeled after them. The letter's just glowing about the experience in New York State. Maybe not glowing, but very positive.
Mitch,
If I might, what is the role of the Attorney General under your bill?
The Attorney General, the way the law currently works, so we don't change this, is that when the case is filed, it's filed under seal and served on the Attorney General, not on the defendant. And the Attorney General has 6 months to look at it and say, this is really a big deal. I'm not going to rely on some qui tam plaintiff. I'm going to take over this case. Or the Attorney General could say, this is just BS, and I'm going to move to dismiss this. They have 6 months, and then at the point that the Attorney General responds to the court, then the seal is lifted and the defendant is served. That's a pretty active role for the Attorney General.
Mr. Chairman, before
Yes.
you move on, whose idea was this bill? Was it yours? Was it some interest group? Was it a council member? Who brought this initially or organically?
Councilmember Che introduced it, and in fact, she introduced it, I think this is the third council period it's been introduced. We had a hearing at the end of council period 22.
Got it, okay, thank you very much.
So, but who, besides the chamber, who opposes it?
The chamber.
The lying chamber.
Yeah, yes, Mitch.
Why the deadline extension for the Police Reform Commission? And does that also equate to a budget increase for that body?
It does not equate to a budget increase. The council is funding is funding a firm that was competitively bid to support the commission, and I've been hands-off, but my understanding is that the commission is working quite well and quite intensely, and that they need more time. I kind of suspected this back in when we set it up. The idea for this was approved by the council on June 7th. It was revised a little bit on July 9th when we adopted the second bill. The appointments weren't made until, I'm going to say, the first week of August. The contract for the support firm wasn't until September, so we've actually lost quite a bit of time there. So it wasn't a surprise that we would need some additional time. And I want them, I don't want them to take forever. I don't think April 1st is unreasonable. I want them to do a good job to muscle through these different issues and try to figure out what, if any, changes we need to make. Mr. Rice, and then I'll...
Does the public health emergency expire December 31st?
Correct.
Are you going to renew it?
Yeah, I don't know. The public health, if everybody heard, the public health emergency that we last approved expires December 31st. We will be meeting December 15th. We will be taking up emergency legislation then to extend it.
And any word on committees? Can you give the preview? And last minute legislation from the two council members who are leaving?
There were two parts to that. Last minute legislation, tomorrow's the drop dead date. And actually that means last week because the deadlines have passed. That's it for legislation. With regard to the other question, a lot of people ask. Thank you. Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anybody else want to ask him about committee assignments? Anybody? Very good. Thank you, Phil. So let's turn to our daily report on the district's experience with COVID. As you know, you can find this dashboard at coronavirus.dc.gov. And I might add, I know that the council commissioned a study about DOH's data, and that study found that we had one of the best 4 dashboards in the country. I think we have the best, but you know, they said best 4, so we'll take it. So congratulations to Dr. Nesbitt and her team, who I know have spent a lot of time, and I also want to acknowledge the members of the press who have spent a lot of time getting to a dashboard that is reflective of our experience and useful for the work that DC Health has to do. We also want to remind any resident who didn't follow our advice and traveled over Thanksgiving to adhere to the district's travel advisory. And that means that you're either restricting for 14 days your activities or staying home for 3 to 5 days, getting tested, then continuing to limit your activities until you receive your test results. We also urge anyone who participated in activities or gatherings where they have been exposed to get tested. And through testing, we can isolate people who are infected and slow the spread of the virus. So again, limit your activities for 14 days or get a test 3 to 5 days after your exposure and continue to limit your activities until you get a negative test result. We now also want to share our testing locations for today. Because of inclement weather, all of our outdoor sites are not available, but F Street and Nationals Park in the garage are available today. You can always contact your own doctor and schedule an appointment for a test. And if you're using one of our sites, please pre-register to save yourself some time and to add your insurance information. We now want to share with you about housing stabilization, which is a huge effect of COVID. We know that a number of our residents have been just devastated financially and have been unable to pay rent, and that has had a ripple effect on the affordable housing in the city. So today we are announcing some relief programs in addition to ones that are already available. The goal is to provide financial relief to tenants unable to pay rent and to preserve the district's stock of affordable housing by helping housing providers make their payments. So to protect affordable housing, we need to make sure tenants are able to stay in their units. Also make sure affordable housing providers have the funds they need to repay their own loans so that they don't lose the property. In early November, the Department of Housing and Community Development, led by Polly Donaldson, sent out a survey to housing providers of all sizes about the impact of COVID, the impact of the COVID public health emergency on their businesses, tenants, and their expectations for the future. And here are some key findings. Of survey respondents with a mortgage, more than 1/3 said they had difficulty with their mortgage in October. And despite considerable efforts to promote emergency rental assistance, most housing providers were unaware of the myriad of district protections and programs that were available to their tenants to help the tenants pay rent, with no program being familiar to more than half of the respondents. And rental assistance for tenants affected by COVID-19 was the top policy proposal that housing providers suggested to DHCD as a response to the crisis. This was in keeping as well with the same top policy proposal from affordable housing providers in DHCD's Affordable Housing Provider Survey conducted over the summer. So right now, the way many of our programs work is that the tenant applies, and then the funding goes directly to the housing provider. This can work to benefit both tenants and housing providers if people know about the programs and apply. But if people aren't applying, then both the tenant and their housing provider are losing out and falling further behind. So as I mentioned, we have put together new housing stabilization grants, which will provide $10 million in direct assistance to housing providers. The program will pay 80% of delinquent rent if the housing provider waives the remaining 20%, as well as any unpaid fees. And here's who can apply. Housing providers of properties in the DHCD and Housing Finance Agency portfolios, and housing providers with 20 or fewer total rental units that are not in the city's portfolio. Applications will open Tuesday, tomorrow, December 1st, and close on Friday, December 11th, and will be assessed on a rolling basis. $9 million will go to providers in the affordable housing portfolio and $1 million to other small housing providers. And because the housing stabilization grants are funded through the CARES Act, all funds must be dispersed by December 31st. I also want to acknowledge and thank Councilmember Anita Bonds, who has been instrumental in trying to find solutions for tenants and affordable housing providers. So, of course, these new grants are in addition to existing rental assistance programs we already have available, and quite candidly, they're being underutilized. So we want to call to everyone's attention the availability of this assistance. The COVID-19 Housing Assistance Program, we call it CHAP, is a $6.2 million program funded by the Federal Community Development Block Grant Program to provide rental assistance to low-income renters who are in arrears due to the impact of COVID-19 public health emergency. And we've listed here, and we will continue to provide on our website the eligibility, the income eligibility requirements for CHAP. To date, only $500,000 of that $6.2 million has been approved. So to get the money out the door, beginning in January, housing providers will also be able to apply directly to the CHAP fund. The other program we want to make sure residents know about is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, which helps low-income residents who are facing housing emergencies by providing funds for overdue rent, as well as security deposits. Again, we have posted the income requirements for ERAP for renters to take advantage of. And finally, residents and housing providers can learn more about these programs by going to coronavirus.dc.gov/rent. So with that, we will take your questions. Yes.
Mayor Bowser, we saw an all-time high in new one-day COVID cases on Saturday. The daily case rate is the highest it's been since May, and the percent of COVID-19 hospitalizations has also crept up the entire month. So I was hoping to just get your assessment of what the latest numbers say, what we saw over the weekend, and is there a concern about an even further spike coming in the weeks after Thanksgiving?
I don't have much to add other than what we've been saying all month or even leading into the month, going into the holidays especially, and going into what we see as a national uptick in COVID cases, that we expect that we're going to have more cases. We are also in a good position to do a lot of testing. We have a very robust testing program in the District of Columbia, on which we feel strongly will help us identify and isolate people who have been infected by COVID. That will help stop the spread. So the investment in our testing program has certainly been a good one. But we continue to monitor, as we post every day, what our public health system is doing, and how it can accommodate people who have been infected by COVID. And you can see today we report that we're in a very good place there.
The Solid Core Fitness Studio, there was some back and forth last week with them, and then over the weekend there was a report that they were actually shut down by the DCRA. So can you just explain what happened there, and what's your message to businesses who have shown opposition to some of the latest restrictions?
Well, let me just say, our business community has been great throughout the response to this pandemic. Listen, we've all had to turn on a dime. There have been a lot of people who have been hurt by COVID, and there are a lot of industries that have been decimated by COVID. We have spent much of the last 8 months doing what we need to do on the public health side, and then trying, as I just mentioned, to provide relief, economic relief, to those that have been affected. So we are sympathetic with any business owner, including the folks at Solid Core, who this virus is affecting. But we have rules, and we have the enforcement mechanisms to make sure they're followed.
And then a couple of quick questions about Chief Newsham. Obviously, he'll be departing soon. Have you talked to him about his departure date? He told me that he was planning to stay through the inauguration. Is that how long you want him to stay? And what qualities are you looking for in business?
We'll have a longer discussion about where we're going with leadership at MPD at a later date. Yes.
Mayor Bowser, why the silence on Chief Newsham when this announcement came out last week, midweek, from another county? How come the mayor's office hasn't said much about it since, aside from the one statement?
Well, that doesn't mean silence. We've issued a statement, and we haven't had any other press opportunity since then.
Can I ask you, a couple council members have talked publicly about this. One council member, McDuffie, had talked about how he's looking for a chief that, or would like to see a chief that can provide more community policing. Another council member, Allen, he mentioned tackling the systemic racism that exists in our city and within policing culture. Do you agree with those comments? Do you feel that the chief did his job in those areas?
I do.
Do you agree with the comments? What do you mean, I do? What is that?
You asked me a question. Do I think the chief did his job? I do.
What is your response then to the comments?
I don't have any response to those comments. We're going to go through a process. I've had the opportunity to appoint a chief in my tenure, and our conversations about the qualities for all of our departments are robust. The police department is special in some ways, in that the members of the police department carry a badge and a gun, and they have a responsibility to make sure our communities are safe and everybody's rights are protected. And so that's the mindset that I went in during our last search, and that's what I will do moving forward.
And can you also explain the contract process, where he was in that process, and how that would move to council?
Excuse me?
Can you explain the chief's contract process, and at what point would it go to the council to decide?
The council's responsibility is to confirm appointments. And so that's when I have a nominee, I will send that nominee to the council. Yes.
At this point, are you thinking internal, external?
I don't really have anything more to say about it right now, Sam. As I mentioned, This is obviously a topic that for its own day. And I expect to name the interim police chief and have a more fulsome conversation about it then.
Today at 4:15, they're supposed to shut down the field of flags. That's in front of RFK Stadium in the DC Armory. I know you've been there, and I guess you approved keeping the flags there up until today. Just your thoughts on that place, and I think maybe my counting may be off, but almost 50,000 people have died since it went up in October.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's a kind of marker in my mind about how many fatalities that we've had in this country, that event. When we were there, I think 220,000 Americans had died. I think now we're over 260 Americans who have died from COVID. And one thing that we talk about here is that sometimes numbers get lost or we get numb to them. And that art display is just a visual representation of people, real people who have died. And when you see it all together, sometimes it makes the numbers that we've almost begun to talk about void of the people connected to them. It brings that home. Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. One more question about Chief Newsham. You appointed him in May, I think, of 2017 as your chief. We've reported, WAMU has reported that you only learned that the chief was going to Prince William County about an hour before Prince William County announced it. It was very unusual even that you would not announce the chief were leaving to a new job. So could you just confirm for us, one, have you spoken to the chief since the announcement? And two, is it correct that you learned about it just shortly before it was made public by Prince William?
Let me just say this, Tom. It is, I have a way that I like to do things to roll people in and to roll people out. Prince William County perhaps has its own way. And that's what I have to say about it. But it in no way reflects, nor will it, how grateful we are for this chief's service to the residents of the District of Columbia.
And I have a better question.
Okay.
Archbishop Wilton Gregory was made a cardinal this past weekend. He's fairly new to the District of Columbia, or whatever the right term is. Have you spoken with him before he went, or do you have planned to speak to him when he comes back, and what are your thoughts about that?
I haven't had the opportunity to speak to him directly. We did, of course, share our congratulations with the Cardinal, and I expect that we'll have an opportunity to speak to him soon. Yes?
If I could just close the loop on Chief Newsham.
Sure.
Do you want him to stay through the inauguration? Will he stay through the inauguration?
I haven't made, I don't have that timeline set yet, Mark.
And if I could switch and just ask some COVID questions?
Sure.
Particularly actually about the vaccine for you and Dr. Nesbitt. I have a couple of vaccine-related questions. One, have you started shopping or acquiring the super cold storage systems that are needed for the one vaccine? Have you been told how many initial doses the district will receive? And have you finalized your plan that I believe is due back on Friday to CDC?
Dr. Nesbitt, and then Chris, if you have any procurement-related updates.
See, today is the day of several questions from the board at one time. Thanks for that, Mark. It's a great opportunity for us to be able to put more information out there about the vaccine, as there are a number of meetings that will be occurring in the federal government in this week and early next week. In terms of the cold chain storage requirements for the vaccine that is being produced by Pfizer, we were recommended to not acquire substantial amounts of freezers in our jurisdictions by our federal partners, but to assess where that capacity or capability rather existed in our jurisdiction, and then assess the capacity where those freezers existed. Fortunately, in the District of Columbia, we were able to identify a number of our acute care providers and some of our retail pharmacies that have that capacity or had begun to purchase that capacity independently, which did not require that the District of Columbia on our own had to go out and purchase a substantial number of those freezers. We did, however, purchase one to have at our, what we call our strategic national, our RSS, our receiving, storage, and I'm blanking on the other S, but RSS warehouse. So there's substantial capacity in the District of Columbia for storage of that vaccine that would be sufficient to store any of the amount of vaccine that we would be expected to receive at any one given period of time. We anticipate that vaccine would be shipped to the District of Columbia in weekly increments of time, weekly or every other week increments of time, either Pfizer alone, Moderna or alone, or any combination thereof of those two vaccines or any that would be subsequently approved. We have the infrastructure for the management of the vaccine distribution channels is somewhat complex in terms of governance. What the federal government is doing is that they are building upon the existing vaccine ordering and just call it vaccine management infrastructure between the states and the federal government, which is through the CDC. So we have been able to have some insight into early estimates of what the District of Columbia would receive in its initial shipment. We are to understand that that number is not necessarily final because the prioritizations for who should receive the vaccines are not final. So that number could move. As it stands, it's about 1/10 of what we would estimate we need for our phase 1A group, which is our healthcare workers. And then your third question, I'm blanking on.
Your final.
Our final plan is not final. That's the key thing to remember. So we have iterative drafts, iterative versions of our plan or drafts of the plan. The plan is basically a living draft document. So we will I think it may have been posted today. There's a current version of our plan that we are in meetings almost on a daily basis with our federal partners, which could be individuals from the Operation Warp Speed team, the CDC, or any component of the federal government, Operation Warp Speed, or some subordinate entity of the Department of Health and Human Services that's responsible for implementation of the rollout of the vaccine. We meet with them frequently regarding various components of the plan. Some of them have to do with prioritization of groups. Some of it have to do with vaccine ordering. Some of it may have to do with which type of IT systems we're going to be using. And some of it has to do with healthcare provider enrollment. So all of those components, there's 15 different areas of the playbook. And so as we make further progress on being ready to receive vaccine after approvals are done, and there are some spaces that often don't get talked about when the OWS or the CDC folks are on TV, but there has to be provider training. So I do want to socialize to folks that vaccine may be shipped here a day after training, but people may not be vaccinated in communities. And I think state and local healthcare providers really do want people to know that, is that people have to be trained on how to administer the vaccine. There are modules that the manufacturers are producing, but it may not be 24 hours, it may be a few days before you actually start vaccinating people because they have to be trained on how to actually do it.
And I appreciate that. If I could just follow up, you said 1/10 of what you need for phase
Sure.
1. What is that number?
So our estimates of our phase 1A group are around, we've been working very closely with healthcare providers and employers in our community to fully understand what our healthcare workforce looks like. And we are not looking at just DC residents who are healthcare workers, but healthcare workers from Maryland and Virginia who are in the district. That number is in the 80,000, has been refined to the 80,000 range. And the initial estimates that we received are not quite 8,000 doses initially. So just for managing expectations and clarification on what we've initially expected to receive. It's critically important to us that we receive sufficient doses of vaccine to vaccinate our workforce and not just our population, as about 75% of healthcare workers in the district are residents of Maryland and Virginia.
Yes?
A few questions on COVID. One with the vaccine, is there any conversation yet on whether government employees would be required to take?
We have not discussed mandates for any population.
Okay. And then with schools, I know there's discussion about possibly returning back to schools or what that conversation looks like. I saw on the website that as of the 27th, there's around 30 employees and students that are quarantining for coronavirus. What is the science right now with schooling as we move into now December?
Can you repeat your question?
What is the science in returning to in-person schooling? What does that look like, and what are you all seeing with that? Is that a danger, or we have kids operating in care classrooms right now? We have around 30 students and employers who are quarantining. What is the science that you guys are seeing behind moving forward with in-person instruction?
Sure. So nationally, I'm sure you're aware that there are plenty of jurisdictions that have lots of students who are in in-person school. And some of those jurisdictions, as we have conversations, and I'll repeat this from last week, is that we look at data from a number of things. We look at who's being impacted from a demographic perspective, so we have that set of data. We look at data that comes in from our contact tracing. We then look at data that comes in terms of the public health science, so things that are in case reports, literature reviews, established public health science. And then our fourth input of information are things that we understand from our colleagues in other jurisdictions, whether they be the epidemiologists, the state health officers, healthcare providers, and people who are actively engaged in the field in the response. And what we are seeing and hearing from colleagues that have students who are enrolled in in-person education, where they have data to compare students who are engaged and enrolled in school versus their cohorts of similar age who are not in an in-person environment. They are seeing that the cases of students case counts among students who are not in an in-person environment are similar or higher than students who are in an in-person environment in some jurisdictions. And that the other phenomena that is being observed is that case counts increase by age. So students in a higher age grades are having higher rates of COVID-19 diagnosis than students who are in lower ages, which is an observation that has been made across the board, whether students are in a hybrid environment or an in-person environment. Case investigations tend to demonstrate that the exposure for the children who are in older grades tends to be associated with extracurricular activities versus their actual in-person experience. So not a exposure related to a transmission in the classroom setting, but related to playing sports, extracurricular activities, or exposures that happen in the community setting, not affiliated with their school exposure at all.
So that being said, and Mayor Bowser, I'm going to answer this as well, but is the city looking at moving forward with expanding and continuing with instruction based on what you guys are seeing?
Yes. Our plan to expand our care classrooms continues.
And then the other question, going back to Solid Core, if you don't mind, the owners there, and there were other business owners who have similar class formats that they were voicing and said that they planned on reaching out to the mayor, frustrated that restaurants and hospitals as well as gyms can stay open, but if they're abiding by similar guidelines, are unable to do so just because it's a class format. Have you all met with any of these business owners in the city? Is there any conversation about potentially revising those restrictions?
As we said throughout, Stephanie, we have to make the decisions that we think are in the best interest of everyone. And unfortunately, many businesses, no fault of their own, nothing that they've done wrong, or industries have been decimated by COVID. We continue to look closely at what we think will keep the district safe, and that's where we are.
What are you finding are the differences between gyms and open classes?
Say again?
What is the difference between gyms still operating and open classes? If they're indoors, where do you see the differences in the gaming?
Dr. Nesbitt, do you want to speak to the question is, what's the difference between a classroom and an open gym?
A class setting.
A group of people, are we still asking about a
Yeah,
group
the
of
group-
people
group
being together
exercise.
versus someone doing something independently? Okay.
Yes.
If they're still.
A group
social
of people
distancing and
doing,
still
a
following
group
the
of people being together versus individual activity? That's the response.
Again,
A
if
group-
they are following the.
A
social
group of
distancing.
people
So
versus
if
individuals.
a machine is 6 feet apart from another machine, and there are two people.
A group of people
exercising.
versus individual activity.
That's what the guidance refers to. It refers to group exercise. Yes, Sam?
Mayor, how much of the CARES Act has been spent? I noticed you were telling people, basically, they got a month to spend this amount, but you got 490, how much is left?
There won't be any left on December 31st. We have either spent it or committed it all. Yes.
There's an unrelated question about MPD. The number of officers who tested positive for the virus on November 16th was 32. That number has since doubled up to 64 as of November 27th. Can the city trace this jump to anything, the Million MAGA March, and are there any numbers on how many officers who were deployed to that march that have gotten sick with the virus?
I don't know that we can link it to one thing, and it sounds like the numbers you mentioned reflect the increase in numbers that we've seen in the city and the region, not doing the math on the spot, but that number sounds like it tracks. Our officers who were deployed for that weekend were all tested, and all obviously any positive cases are isolating and quarantining.
And then one more question for you. How is the city preparing for winter storms this year? And how has the pandemic changed what the normal preparations might look like? Is there any concern about funding about that? And then we saw, for example, today the inclement weather caused testing sites to close. So what are you thinking about as it gets colder and snowstorms hit, et cetera?
We, at this point, Chris can talk a little bit more. Director Geldhart is not with us today. He can talk a little bit more about our winter preps. But throughout, we're asking people, don't forget to contact your own provider, your doctor, or the healthcare center that you go to, because that should really be your first stop for COVID testing. We don't anticipate having an indoor site at this stage, so we have to be responsive to the weather conditions. We have hardened our sites some on F Street with more substantial tents so that the staff who is there has some protection from the elements and heat. And we're using the garage at Nationals Park so that we will always be able to have some public availability. But we also need to make sure that the private capacity out there is being used. Anything else, Chris, that I'm?
Mayor, I think you covered it for our testing sites. They have been, the F Street location and has been winterized with additional tents. And we did move into a parking garage at Nats Park in order to make sure that any inclement weather could be dealt with for those testing sites. In terms of our preparations for the winter season, every year DPW, the Department of Public Works, does a snow dry run. Director Geldart and his team did that probably about 3 weeks ago, 2 to 3 weeks ago, with the Department of Transportation. HCMA was there. And so we're just going to continue to watch for any potential winter weather. We're in touch with the National Weather Service on a daily basis to make sure that if there are any, is there any inclement weather or snow that's coming our way, we know well in advance.
And in terms of funding, I know it's kind of stressed already because of the pandemic. Is there any concern about being able to brace for the winter in terms of funding?
It is not. Yes, sir.
Clarifying question on the vaccines for Dr. Nesbitt, the 8,000 doses, how, do we know how how we got to that number?
All we know at this point is that the Operation Warp Speed team and the CDC are providing allocations to states using what they call a pro rata share by population. We have requested that they do reconsider and provide the district a pro rata share based on population, based on our workforce, given our porous borders, and other requests that they have made for us to vaccinate what they consider to be essential workforce in our region.
Question, Mayor Bowser, on the inauguration. Are there any updates on the district's role in the inaugural ceremony or parade or anything like that?
I understand that the transition has now officially named as leadership for the Presidential Inauguration Committee. I had a chance to talk to that team last week, and at this point, we await what the President-elect's plans are. I know they had a similar conversation with the, they call it the Joint Congress Committee. They also have a Joint Congressional Committee as well. So I think all of those bodies that are responsible for planning the inauguration are engaged, and I will continue to be in close contact with them. Yes?
For COVID testing, some of the public sites are experiencing long lines and wait times. If cases continue to spike, would you consider opening additional testing sites or expanding that in any way?
Oh, well, we expanded it last week. So we added an additional site, and we also added more hours. And from time to time, we also have, for lack of a better word, we pop up in different neighborhoods. So our testing capacity can grow. But we also know that there will be limits to how much can grow. Yes?
Just following up to the pick that was announced today by President-elect, has the city taken a stand so far on what you would like to see in terms of, do you want buses? Is the city going to allow buses of people coming to the district for an inauguration? Congress members handing out tickets? Have you all taken a stance on that already?
We of course will weigh in, but we want to know what they're thinking about, and we don't know that yet. Yes. Oh, yes.
Sorry, just a follow-up
Uh-huh.
question, Dr. Nesbitt, because I maybe didn't ask this correctly the first time. But for the business owners who are concerned, I would like to ask you, could you please explain if there is a smaller class inside a facility that has similar space to a gym, that is doing temperature checks, that is wearing masks and applying social distancing, how that class exercise might be different from individuals going to a gym that are also doing temperature checks, that are wearing masks, and that are social distancing.
Stephanie, can I jump in? Because I know where you're going with the question, and I think you asked it just fine. But we know that we have a difference of views with this one establishment. And that's something that we're happy to go over them with. I know that they've had, various media appearances. But this is a regulated business in the District of Columbia. And we have to make sure that they're following our rules. So I don't want to spend too much more time on a single issue, but we're always happy to talk to our businesses.
I appreciate that, but I'm asking because it's not just that establishment.
One, I'd refer you to the guidance document on it. And two, I'd ask people to recognize that we've talked about data here. I've talked to you all about the 4 types of data and information that we use to make decisions, and respect that we don't attempt to make hardship for any business without having a deliberate process for doing so. And then, as Mayor Bowser said, we'll end that topic there.
Okay, I'll take a couple more, and then
Thanks.
I have some comments.
Is there any data that you can give us on the new request for insurance data for people taking the COVID tests? How many people are filling that out, how that's going? I know it's soon, but I'm just wondering if...
Do you know that?
Sure, Mark. I don't have the final data from last week with me, but the first day we had about 80% of people present with their information, and then I had data sent to me by midweek. On another site midweek, we had about 50% of people who were pre-registering were providing their information during pre-registration. But I'd like the benefit of being able to give you the sum total for the first week of how it went overall.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can I ask about Jerry M? I don't know how, I know you got a lot on your plate, but it appears in the court docket that there's a joint motion before the judge, I believe tomorrow, that would seek to dismiss the oversight of DYRS. And I'm wondering, one, if I have that correct, and what you think that means for youth rehabilitations. That, I mean, this has been something that has been, previous mayors have dealt with for years.
Yes.
And now it looks like it may be coming to an end.
I plan to participate in the hearing virtually. I've done that once before. The time I did that before, the case was dismissed. It was, I don't know if dismissed is the right word, but it was resolved. And we were out of court oversight. And so not wanting to get ahead of the hearing tomorrow, we have worked very hard on an agreement that the monitor, the court, and the district are satisfied with. So let me just say before we go, and again, I want to thank the chairman for being here. I don't typically respond to all the measures because clearly there are a lot before the council. And it is our practice that we send a letter to the council with the executive's position on a number of the bills. I will just say there was some questions about why some back and forth with the DC Chamber and the chairman and the like on a particular issue. And our position is that, you know, the businesses, as we've heard from a number of questions, are dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So I will look at all of the bills before the council in hopes that the council isn't introducing more regulation or uncertainty on their operations at this time. And so that's just kind of one lens that we look at it through. The other lens is I think that we have to be very careful about growing the government. And we're going to go into, it appears, the next budget season looking for how we can get more out of the government that we have. Or we may have to make the very difficult decision to actually make cuts to services. So I will be very concerned, and I will look at all of the bills very closely that would suggest that we should grow the government. We try to have our comments to the council. I think the council has moved its start time, which is helpful. Is that right? Are you start at noon now? At noon now. So we try to get out a piece of a letter so that all the council members and you know our position on various bills. Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Could we hear the chairman respond to that you want to be very careful about growing the government?
Sure.
Did this come as a surprise to you, Mr. Chairman, or did you discuss it beforehand?
Growing the government?
The fact that you made that remark.
Well, I view those as principles, and I generally share those principles. I think we should be mindful that there are limits to, there are financial limits to government, and therefore there are limits to how much we can grow the government, for example.
Okay, thank you, everybody.